Well, for those that don't know me, I'm Graham Huon, and this is the AES Melbourne section meeting. So you're on the right channel, I hope. For tonight's session, we're very privileged to have Abbey Road and EMI Studios 301 engineer, producer, and studio manager, Martin Benge, who is presenting. The recording industry underwent a series of major revolutions between the 60s and 80s. Recording technologies advanced from magnetic tape and stereo vinyl recording through multi-tracking and onto digital capture production and distribution. Audio merged with video for the mass market and world mega artists flourished. Those who survived would have colourful memories of the era, but it's sobering to remember that colour television first appeared in Australia in 1975. So you can't have colour memories, maybe. And that was towards the end of this explosive growth. Tonight, Martin will give us some insights into the people and the technical realms of the recording industry, from the hectic 60s in England and EMI Abbey Road perspective, to add the local flavour of EMI Studio 301 in Sydney through the 70s. Few people have had this breadth and depth of experience. There are a few Zoom session housekeeping chores tonight. Martin is welcoming questions. Thanks for that, Martin. But we'll divide his presentation into three logical parts. He's asked that questions be held to the end of each of these parts to maintain a balance of the flow and of the relevance of those questions. You can use the session chat facility, if you all know where that is, down in your menu. Use the session chat facility to note the questions as you want when you think of them, and we'll answer those or address those at the end of each of the three sections. Can you please keep your microphone muted unless invited to talk, as this reduces the general background noise and possibly the hum. There will be a general wrap-up and discussion at the end of the session. So, can you please give an unmuted welcome to Martin and then mute your microphones.
Thank you, Graham, and thanks, everybody. It's great to finally be here. I've been actually quite nervous about this evening. It's my first sort of real go at a full-on presentation on Zoom, so I think it's only fair to warn you that anything could happen, and probably will. But as Graham said, we're going to cover quite a bit of ground this evening. We're going to start off with some of the activities I undertook in the UK. And then we're going to talk about the Australian side of things and move on to what happened sort of much later when I came back from Abbey Road to Australia for what I'm basically doing now. So let's get started. I guess first up, I better say how lucky I feel I am to have been able to get paid for doing what I've always loved, and that's being involved in sound, music and electronics. And it's been my passion since I was a kid, and I finally sort of managed to work my way into a situation where I could get paid for it, which was absolutely wonderful. So let's kick off here with starting out in the 1960s. I joined EMI in September 1962 at the age of 18 as an electronics engineering apprenticeship. My parents were very supportive of me getting involved with what my father always says, a good, solid British firm, and that happened to be EMI. And I certainly didn't join the company with the expectation of getting into the music business. Quite the contrary. I started out my training with the company in the electronics division, and that took me to the factory site in Hayes, where I started my apprenticeship in 1962. And just by coincidence, happy coincidence I might add, 1962 was the year that EMI signed the Beatles. So we were both starting out at the same time with the company. Now this is on your screens. You can see the shot of the EMI factory site as it was in 1931, and it was still very much like that in the 1960s when I first started work there, in that building in the foreground with his master's voice over the top of it. That, in fact, was EMI Electronics, that building. And there were various other buildings that you can see there. I don't know whether you can see my cursor there, but this was the EMI Electronics building. It was a vast industrial conglomerate, EMI, at those days, an international company spread over many, many countries. And the music part of the company that was actually the smallest bit of it in those days. There was a huge electronics division which dealt in medical equipment scanners, airborne radar for the British defence industry, microwave technology. They used to make everything on site there, from radiograms to record players, televisions, and of course recording equipment, which is what I was most interested in, but never imagined that it would lead to a career as a recording engineer. But anyway, more of that later on. So the companies in those days, the big record companies, were all vertically integrated organizations, I think that's the term, and companies like EMI, Philips, Decca, Pi in the UK, and RCA and all those big companies in the United States were completely self-contained with their own A&R departments, their own marketing, manufacturing, recording studios, and worldwide distribution, and it was all done in-house. And all these companies, or many of them anyway, had recording studios. But EMI had their original studios on this site in Hayes, originally, right next to the factory, and many historic recordings were made there, including some by Dame Nellie Melba and Peter Dawson, two great Australian artists who sold millions of records for the company during the early years. And it was nice to have that Australian connection there. Found that quite gratifying that EMI recognised those two talents and promoted them so well. So the next part of the presentation, I'm just going to jump across to a little bit of video here, and we're going to have a look at the ceremonial opening of Abbey Road Studios in 1931. And the film cameras were there to look at Sir Edward Elgar conducting the London Symphony Orchestra playing Land of Hope and Glory. Now I'm just going to jump across here to another application, so just bear with me for 1 second. Now, that's the opening of Abbey Road. And so by the 1965, I'd actually transferred from the department at Hayes, where I was working, learning how to build the recording equipment that was going out to all EMI studios around the world. And of course, it's well known that EMI made fine recording consoles, tape machines. They made tape, and in the early days, they also made microphones. So they really were a very busy organization, keeping their empire equipped around the world with recording equipment and knowledge and facilities. So when I joined EMI in those early years, I managed to get a stint as an apprentice in the department at the Hayes factory, where we were assembling consoles and equipment to go out to all the different studios in the UK and Europe and around the world. And it was a great place to learn how the equipment worked. So when I went up to Abbey Road in 1965, I was towards the end of my apprenticeship training. They put me in the amp room, and the amp room was the sort of I guess an odd term for the technical department, but it dates back to the time when that workshop that was the technical department used to be the room where most of the amplifiers were housed in racks for the early cutting equipment back in the 1930s and so on. Now, we had to wear white coats in those days as technical engineers, and our job while we were working in the studios themselves was to set up the microphones and to get everything interconnected and to do all the patching. So all the engineer had to do was to walk in and push up the faders and look good. And I was hankering after a bit of that myself by this stage. I was very, very keen to get into the recording side of things rather than the technical side. So that was something that I identified very early on in my time at Abbey Road, that's really what I really wanted to do. But I didn't think it would be possible because there was a lot of demarcation between the departments. And if you were on the technical side, that's where you stayed. And if you were on the recording side, you also stayed in that. And never the twain shall meet, so to speak. But I managed to get moved across to the recording department in the late 60s, and they let me loose on a number of recording sessions, which once I did my first one, I realized that this was going to be a very, very steep learning curve. And whilst I knew how the equipment worked, because I built quite a lot of it at Hayes, I really had no idea how things should sound, even though I could push the faders up and make everything work. But the one thing that I really had to learn was how to get my ears going and start listening and start working out, how things sounded and how to make things sound better and how to use the equipment to produce great sound rather than just how it functioned. In the screen shot at the moment, you can see the Red 51 console in Studio 2 at Abbey Road. And this was the last of the Red series of consoles. There were 3 Red series. There was the Red 17. Dave Hudson, very familiar with that desk, of course, because there's one in Melbourne, I believe. And the Red 37. And I think I'm right in saying both the Red 17 and the Red 37 were both German-built desks. They were built by EMI Electrola in Germany and then distributed to the various different studios that had that equipment. The main difference really between the Red 17 and the 37 and the 51 was the Red 17 was 2-track stereo, had 2 buses, and the Red 37 and the Red 51 had 4 output buses, so they were really more designed for 4-track recording. When 4-track first came into Abbey Road, the machines were Telefunken M10s and T9Us. They were a 1-inch machine, and they were used mainly for operatic recording originally, and the technique was to record the orchestra on 2 tracks in stereo and the voices and the chorus on the other 2 tracks as a stereo pair, and then they'd be combined to make a 2-track stereo master on 1/4 inch as a sort of a mix down. And it wasn't envisaged in the very early days of 4-track that these machines would become in high demand for pop recording. In fact, there's some funny things happened really, because the Musicians Union actually banned overdubbing until 1960, so it was impossible to use the 4-track machines in that kind of way because of the Musicians Union ruling. And as far as the musicians were concerned, everyone had to be in the studio at once, including the vocalist. Otherwise, the session just did not go ahead. Oh gosh, funny old world. Anyway, I've got a little bit of audio on here for you, which I hope you can hear. Whether my settings are still correct, let me know if you can't. This is one of my early efforts. It's an old-time dance orchestra, which I recorded in Studio 2 in 1967, and this was done direct to 2-track stereo on this very console. Producer Bob Barrett in charge, and I actually think it was quite a good effort, really, for an early job. Yeah, so my job description in those days was balance engineer, not recording engineer, because our job was to balance the sound, and the engineering was done by the boys in the amp room. And so our job as balance engineers was to get a balance, because most of the recordings when I started out were all direct to 2-track stereo. So there was no mixing going on after the session. You basically had to get it all balanced and the levels adjusted and everything right on the night, so to speak, in the studio at the time the musicians were there. And so it's a little bit hair-raising, but you could walk out of the studio at the end of the day and you could do a whole side of an LP in a day, 6 or 7 tracks. It was amazing. A little bit of editing possibly down the track a little bit later, but you basically ended up with a finished product at the end of the recording session, which was really quite refreshing, actually. The equipment itself was very basic. We had 8 microphone channels, a couple of echo return faders next to the 4 main bus faders in the middle of the desk. But that really wasn't enough for a lot of the sessions, so you'll notice up on the left-hand side of the console there's a little outrigger with 4 faders on it, and that was a premix unit. And we could use those to sub-mix 4 microphones down to 1 input on the desk to give us a little bit more capacity. But this was a passive device, so it didn't have any power on it. So we relied on using the higher output microphones like the condensers to feed into that to mix down afterwards. But the ribbon mics and some of the lower output mics weren't suitable for the using on those channels. So you had to use the main channels for those microphones. Under the desk front here, there's some controls which control the reverberation and send and return signal to the echo chamber at the back of the studio. We did have EMT plates in those days, but the echo chambers sounded a hell of a lot better, and each studio had its own echo chamber room, which was set up with all sorts of tricks and so on. And in the number 2 echo chamber, we had large round water pipes standing in a bare concrete room with a single loudspeaker and a couple of microphones, a couple of omnidirectional microphones, and they would be the echo returns, and the Altec loudspeaker would be the echo send. And the number 2 echo chamber in particular was a really great sounding reverb. It had a decay time of up to about 1.5 seconds, and really did enhance the sound of vocalists in particular, but was pretty good on most things. And on that recording I just played you, that's quite a bit of number 2 echo chamber on that recording there. Now I'll just move on to, next slide here. This is the just a close-up of the EQ section of the Red 51. All we had really was just bass and treble controls, and not a lot of gain, I might add, particularly on the classical format. You'll notice in these little slots here, you can see pop. These desks were used for classical recording as well, and there was a classical EQ setting that would involve removing the unit underneath the panel and replacing it with a classical set of EQ components, and that would change the characteristic of the of what you were getting on the bass and treble controls according to what kind of repertoire you were using. But there wasn't a lot of boost and cut available to you, so you pretty much had to get the sound right by mic position and mic choice and acoustic treatment in the studio and so on and so forth. So it was I think in many respects, we learnt very quickly which microphones to use and which sounded best and where to put them. And it was good not to have too much sort of trickery available to us, because we learnt the basics very early on in the piece. And I think that was a good thing. I did my first Beatles session actually a year before this, in 1967, but I'm going to play you a little bit of audio from the session I did with the Beatles in 1968 across the universe, and that was using the same Red 51 desk. Yeah, that was a session in 1968, that one, and it was quite an interesting afternoon, actually. I got roped in to do the session because Ken Scott, who was involved in a number of Beatles sessions before me, was booked to do the session, but he got sick, and I was seconded. George Martin thought that it might be worth giving me a go, and the boys agreed, so I got to do that session, which was a terrific opportunity. Interesting things happened during that afternoon. The lads wanted to get some backup vocals from, they wanted some female singers, and it wasn't a particularly difficult vocal part that they had in mind, just singing the chorus Jackaroo Deva, which features in that song. And so they got the EMI commissionaire, who used to sit out on the front of the building checking people in and out, and they got him to go out to the famous zebra crossing where there was a huge crowd. There always was when the Beatles were in the studio, and his instructions were to find the 3 prettiest girls he could find and ask them to come in and see whether they'd like to sing on the Beatles record. And these 3 young girls came into the studio, and they were, pretty overwhelmed with the whole thing. 2 of them actually survived to sing on the track, but one of them was dismissed because she really couldn't cut it. But and of course they both became quite famous. I think one of them was called Lizzie Bravo, as I remember. But yeah, a lot of things I don't remember about that day, but I do certainly remember that incident. And yeah, there was a fun afternoon. I also, a year earlier, talking about recording the Beatles, I got to work on All You Need Is Love. I wasn't the actual engineer on that. Jeff Emmerich was engineering, and Richard Lush was the second engineer, but it was a very big session because we were doing a live satellite OB via the BBC to some 400 million people around the world. And that session went out live from Abbey Road via the BBC via a satellite link to a lot of different countries. And I was helping out technically and running the echo machine at the back of the control room and madly trying to keep things on an even keel technically, which was a bit of a challenge. But the session went off pretty well, really, when all said and done. And it's become quite a famous piece of film, the satellite broadcast of that recording session, All You Need Is Love. Just about every man and his dog came into that session, the Rolling Stones and all their friends from across the musical scene in London came in on that day, Marianne Faithfull to name but a few, and it turned into a giant party, which was great. Yeah, it was quite an afternoon. Anyway, as I progressed through the organisation at Abbey Road, Alan Stagg was the studio manager in those days, and he was very keen to get me involved in some classical sessions. He thought that as an amateur clarinet player, I might be able to add something to the classical engineering team. And so I moved over to the classical recording department for a while, probably about a year actually, and worked on a number of recordings with people like Otto Klemperer and the London Symphony Orchestra and the New Philharmonia and so on. And this particular recording session, which I'm just going to play you a clip of now, was with Yehudi Menuhin playing the Walton Violin Concerto in Studio One. I'm not convinced that this is the actual photograph of the session, but it is an illustration of the setup that we used to, or I used to use anyway, for my classical recording sessions. Across the front of the orchestra, there are 3 M50 omnidirectional Neumanns, and there's a U67 there over the percussion section, and I think we might have had a couple of KM56s on the woodwinds, but I don't know whether we could see them there. But this was a typical sort of classical recording session, and again, it was a direct to two-track recording with a bit of editing afterwards to get the best possible performance and accuracy as per the producer's requirements. But it was, we used to record say 2 or 3 takes of a particular movement, and that would be then either accepted as one would be accepted as the best take, or there would be edits between the different takes to create the best possible version of it. So let's have a listen to one of my early efforts here with Yehudi Menuhin in Studio One. Wasn't only large orchestras, of course, we used to record in this studio. It was often used for pop sessions, and that required use of quite a few screens to dampen down the reverberation time, because it wasn't really a suitable studio for pop recordings. But because of the amount of work going through the studio at the time, we had to improvise and try and work with the acoustics in that room. But the worst fear of any of us as recording engineers was to have a drummer in there with an orchestra trying to play live. It was a nightmare. Because we didn't have an isolation booth originally, but there is one there now, but when I was there, we didn't have that. I also did quite a lot of work in this studio with Daniel Barenboim, the concert pianist, and we recorded the entire Beethoven piano sonatas over a period of several months in Studio One. And I was really lucky to work with him. He was a wonderful artist. He was pretty young at the time, about my age. And we got on really well and became really good mates, I would say. And he wanted something a little bit different from the engineers that had been working with him before, who'd insisted on using stereo pair for recording the piano and nothing else. But he wanted the sound a bit more open and a bit more spacious. So I was quite up for doing a bit of experimentation and settled on using a pair of U67s on the piano, not too close in, maybe I suppose a couple of meters back, and then a couple of M50s right up in the as high as I could get them in the back of the studio, and used those as ambient mics. And he really liked the sound, and so did the producer. So we hit on a formula for getting a good result for those recordings, and they've survived to this day on CD now. I think they've all been re-released, but it was a pretty mammoth undertaking because there's a lot of music in those Beethoven piano sonatas. So yeah, in Studio One as well, just before we move on, of course, that was where we did the Beatles session, All You Need Is Love. So that was done in there as well, as were many other pop sessions at the time. Equipment-wise, the old BTR2s and BTR3s were the workhorse of the day, and these machines did pretty much all the recording work during my early days at Abbey Road, before we got involved in multi-track recording. Each control room would have 2 BTR2s in and probably 2 BTR3s as well. And then for each recording session, each machine would be lovingly tweaked up with each batch of tape was the machine had to be the bias had to be adjusted to suit the batch of tape, and the levels, repro and record levels, were adjusted accordingly. And at least twice a week, all the machines would be degaussed. So there was quite a bit of work involved in maintaining this equipment, and of course setting the azimuth on the record and repro heads as well. So very, very maintenance heavy. And very often you'd find a noisy valve in the record or repro side, which had to be dealt with as well. But these chassis here inside the machine were on rollers, and the chassis could be pulled out and swapped over, and that was something we did very often. Rather than trying to change valves in the studio, we just swapped the whole amp out, and for one that had been tested upstairs in the amp room to get the machines working again. One of the things we didn't enjoy very much was having to carry these machines around the building. They were lugged up and down stairs because we didn't have a lift, and they are a very, very heavy machine. So I think it might have something to do with the fact I've got a crook back now, but anyway, it was something we had to do. Another thing which was extraordinary is some of the things that happened at EMI in those days. There was a decree from on high that all the equipment should be grey, and all the BTR2s and BTR3s, when the green ones that was, were all fully dismantled and shipped off to the factory at Hayes and resprayed in battleship grey. A total labour of love that made absolutely no difference to the performance of the equipment whatsoever, just to make it look more modern, they thought. But incredible that they went to all that trouble. Anyway, things got very interesting when 4-track arrived in a big way with the J37 multi-track. As I mentioned earlier, we used the old Telefunkens originally for 4-track work, which were very clunky and not really that user-friendly for pop recording. But when the J37 came along, it was a work of art, that machine. Beautiful Swiss engineering and excellent electronics and a great mechanical transport system. These machines were the absolute workhorse of Abbey Road for many, many years. And on a lot of the sessions, we would use 2 of them and do 4-track to 4-track copies, reducing 4 tracks down to 1 or 2 on the other machine, and then doing more overdubbing, because the race was on really for more and more tracks. 4 really wasn't enough, but we managed to work around it, and it's pretty amazing to think that albums like Sergeant Pepper, with all that's going on there, was recorded on 4-track tape. Incredible, really. They used other machines to fly stuff in, mono and stereo machines, so there was a lot of hardware in use during those particular sessions. But they were a fine machine. And by the sort of mid-1960s, the Musicians' Union had come on board with the idea that you didn't have to have the whole orchestra there in one hit with a singer. We were then allowed to do rhythm section and overdubbing of the extra instruments and vocal parts without running into trouble with the union. I'm going to inflict another one of my early efforts on you now. This is a recording I made with Kathy Kirby in 1968 in Studio 2. Yeah, Kathy Kirby there with Something's Happening. And I can remember that session quite clearly because Kathy Kirby was hitting it off big time with producer Pete Sullivan on those sessions. They were getting on very, very well indeed. And in the evening, when Kathy Kirby was back on her own doing vocal overdubs, Peter and Kathy would disappear into the back of the studio with all the lights off for rather long periods of time, and made me very suspicious as to what was going on. But I was sworn to secrecy. It's out of copyright now, though, so I'm allowed to talk about it. Oh, yes, those were the days. So, yeah, that's as I said, the race for tracks was on in those days, and it wasn't long before the first 8-track machine arrived in 1968, the 3MM23. It was a machine that was all that was available really for providing reliable 8-track recording, but unfortunately it had two glaring anomalies really compared to the J37. It had no separate sync output, and it had no clock on it, so you had absolutely no idea where you were on the tape if you were relying on the clock to tell you how much tape had passed over the heads in terms of time. So there was a lot of hit and miss with where you landed up when you were running back to drop in. And of course, the lack of a sync repro amplifier was a big problem. So the boffins in the research labs upstairs on the top floor of Abbey Road got to work, and they modified the machine so that we got a separate sync output, which was a very handy thing to have for a lot of the type of work we were doing. We used to monitor, interestingly, off tape quite a bit of the time in these early sessions, because there wasn't always time for full playbacks. And so you did need to know that you were getting something down on tape. And we would often listen off repro. And looking through the window at the musicians in the studio, of course, everything would be out of sync. It looked quite extraordinary. But that was one of the peculiarities of the way we were working in those days. We're going to have a break in a minute. I've just got a couple of more equipment-y things to talk about before we do. Probably the biggest change technically in Abbey Road when I was there really was the change in the console technology from the old valve gear to the EMI built TG solid state consoles, the TG 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 series. The first one arrived in 1968, and it was designed around 8-track recording, but it also had a rather good feature on it. You'll notice in the center section of the desk there are 5 pairs of main faders there which are grouped together, and the first 4 were for the 1 to 8 tracks of the multi-track, and the other 2 faders there were for an auxiliary stereo output. And so you could actually do a submix of the 8 main outputs into a stereo bus to provide a simultaneous stereo recording, which was something that we used to make quite good use of. When these consoles arrived, we were confronted with a massive learning curve, because we got so used to working with the valve technology where you had a lot of headroom, and you could really punish those old red consoles before they went into distortion. But the TG console was a different beast altogether. You could very easily clip your input levels into distortion by just going a few dBs over the headroom of the input amplifiers, and you had to be very, very careful about distortion. And I had a disastrous session, one of my first goes on the TG console. We got a very distorted snare drum, which wasn't apparent until you started soloing the tracks to listen to what we were getting. So I got into a bit of trouble over that, actually. Anyway, didn't make the same mistake twice, but it was a big learning curve. Now, these guys here, you might recognize this gentleman here. This is Richard Lush in 1968, and Peter Vince there, the recording engineer who did all that work with Cliff and the Shadows and a lot of other big acts in Abbey Road. Alan Stagg, the studio manager, and Keith Slaughter, one of the senior amp room boffins, the technical engineers. Yeah, so that was the second or third day we'd had the TG console in the studio. The Mark II was a far better console. For a start, it was designed for 16-track recording, and it had superior electronics and features to the Mark One. And in fact, this was the console that we had installed in Sydney in 1974. And compared to what we had before, it was just chalk and cheese. It was just a fabulous desk. And with the Studer 16-track machine, was just a great recording chain. And, you know, you'd be happy to use that now, and without any hesitation at all in terms of signal quality and final result. Great piece of kit, the TG console, particularly from the Mark II onwards. And then, of course, after the final one of the TG series was the Mark IV, still a 16-track format desk, but more channels and this rather attractive curved shape. So it was quite a nice design. And we had 3 of these desks at Abbey Road ultimately, before going to the EMI Neve consoles, which went on, and then finally SSLs and so on and so forth. But that's another story. So this desk was not this particular one, but one of the desks of this series was used for Dark Side of the Moon, recorded by Alan Parsons. So I think before we're going to take a break after this, before we start talking about the Australian end of things. So I'll just play you a little bit of Dark Side of the Moon just to chill us out, and then we'll stop and have a bit of a chat. Yeah, so what a great recording that was. I don't know what you think, but I think it's one of the finest records that's ever been made. The other one of my favourites is Sgt. Pepper, but those 2 albums were, you know, in my opinion, certainly the major milestones during my career as a recording engineer. I just wish I'd recorded them myself, but you have to take your hats off to Alan Parsons and Jeff Emmerich for their excellent work on those records. Okay, so we'll have a little break there before we start talking about Australia.
And I can wind back on the questions that have been asked. Have you got that list there, Martin? The first question was from Tom Fine. What changed your interests to recording versus technical?
Well, I guess a love of sound and a love of music, because as a kid, I had always been just fascinated by how things sounded. I started to buy, and when I was at school, I started to buy these old radiograms from jumble sales and junk shops, and play around with them and try and make them sound good. And I just loved loudspeakers, and I loved the sound of the things. And I might add, I nearly electrocuted myself on one of the moving coil speakers in one of those things once, not realizing that they were energized with about 400 volts to make them work. I learnt the hard way there, but I think it was kind of in my makeup that I would always gravitate to wanting to be involved in the creation and the manipulation and production of sound, rather than just being an electronic sort of wizard. I got more interested really in the idea of actually being able to control sound and to record it and work with it. And when the first time I ever walked into Abbey Road, I was looking around, so I was taken around by one of the technical guys, and we went into Studio One, and there was Peter Bowen recording the Jeff Love Orchestra, and I just stood at the back of the room and looked at what was going on, and I just knew that that's what I wanted to do. How I was going to get there was another matter, but I had a bit of luck, you know, and I managed to get across onto the recording side.
Oh, okay. The next question was, were the speakers of the 60s in-house built or EMI built?
Some of them were. The speakers in Studio 2 in that old picture we looked at some way back were Altex 604s.
Yes. Tom Fine said that.
Yeah, and those speakers were used for most of the pop work in that studio. EMI had an eminent acoustician who built speakers called Professor Dutton. And Professor Dutton worked in the research labs at Hayes, where they used to build speakers, and we were asked to change all the speakers over to the Duttons. And the Duttons were made to look a bit like the Altecs. And I think they had, if my memory serves me correct, I think the actual driver unit was a Wharfedale, a 15-inch Wharfedale in those speakers. But the actual cabinet design and crossovers and everything else was pure EMI, was Dutton. And these speakers were known as the Duttons, but we hated them. They were used a bit more for classical work, but we didn't really enjoy the Duttons, and we couldn't wait to get back to the Altecs really for any sort of meaningful judgment on what we were recording. And then a little bit later on, when Alan Stagg came in as studio manager, he had a different view of the world as far as loudspeakers were concerned, and he brought in the Tannoy Lancasters, which he'd been using at IBC Studios, and they were a complete revelation in sound, so different to anything we'd ever heard before, far more top end and far more extreme bass, to the extent that it was almost too good, because if you relied on what the speaker was telling you during a mix, when you took it out of the studio, it wouldn't have enough bass and it wouldn't be bright enough. So those speakers we didn't feel they were really suitable for pop recording. And that was, although they weren't EMI built speakers, they were inflicted on us by the management, and lasted for a while. And then we moved on to JBLs, 4320s and 4335s and 4340s. And ultimately, I think we had some Gen X in there as well. And then in the latter years, during the time I was over in the UK during the 90s, we virtually become entirely B&W, Bowes and Wilkins, for all studios actually. So I'd been through a few different types of speakers, and then in Australia we went on a different journey, which I'll talk to you about when we move on with the presentation.
While we're on the topic of loudspeakers, Neville Teal worked at EMI on television, not loudspeakers, when they were setting up television in Australia for both black and white and colour. Did you ever get to meet him? Probably not.
Not Graham Thurkle.
No, Neville Teal.
Neville Teal. No, I didn't. No, okay. I didn't. No.
Now, the next question was about the reverb. I think you answered those questions. People wanted to know how you were doing the reverb, but you covered it.
Mm-hmm.
Microphone arrangements, did you use multi-mic, Bloomline, Tree? What did you use?
Well, my preference was for multi-cardioid setups, personally. I could never really get on with stereo pairs, except when we were going out to record some of the fine cathedral organs in and around the UK, because we did a lot of recording in churches and cathedrals and concert halls and so on. And the stereo pairs really came into their own in those type of environments, in my opinion. But in the studio, the name of the game really was control, being able to respond to the producers and musicians, what they wanted, really. In other words, being able to change the sound. And if you were just using a multi-mic array, you were pretty much you put the array in the position that you thought was best, and then you get a good stereo image, but the balance might not be quite right. You could alter some of that by talking very nicely to the conductor and saying we need to bring up the second violins here, or we're not quite hearing that viola melody or whatever, and that would sometimes work. But I preferred the multi-mic technique, which would, for my technique, I would generally use 367s in a cardioid pattern across the front of the orchestra, and then a few spot mics here and there to be able to bring up different sections if required. And that was the technique that I sort of settled on in the end for my own sort of preferences. But I noticed, when I went back to the UK in the 90s, that engineers like Peter Cobbin and John Kurlander were using these custom-built microphone trees, which were built to their specific concept to put the mics in the position that they wanted them to be in. And, for instance, the other famous microphone arrays, the Decca tree, of course, that was a popular configuration. Never used it myself, but so I think there's a type, there's a place and a need for all these different kinds of techniques. It's just a question of what you as an engineer, I suppose, settle on, and it enables you to deliver what your clients want. And I found the multi-mic technique with using the 3 U67s out in the front of the orchestra as being something I could work with and generally deliver what people wanted.
Okay, thanks for that. Tom Fine said he spotted some Yamahas or some Ampex MM1200 speakers in one of the photos. Probably not.
TG Mark IV.
TG Mark IV.
TG. Those are NS10s.
Yeah, NS10s and MM1200 16. He's just wondering, I think it's about the timing, 1980s question mark. So this is a later photograph.
Yeah, what are we looking at? The TG?
Yeah, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 Mark IV.
Yeah, these are NS10s, aren't they?
Yeah.
These speakers, yeah.
Yep. So do you know where that photo was taken?
Oh, well, it's certainly not at Abbey Road.
No.
No. Well, Mike Hedges, one of the producers that worked at Abbey Road, he bought one of these desks, so it could possibly be in his studio. I actually don't know where that desk is, that particular one, but it was the best photograph I could find of a Mark IV for my presentation, but I don't know whose studio it is.
Langley Cello asked, did you ever use RCA LC1As?
No.
Okay.
Never tried them.
What were the studio foldback tall speakers? And when did you go from studio playback for ODs to headphones?
The tall speakers, they were on a kind of trolley mount that you could push around. I'm just trying to think what they were. They might even have been
tannoys, wouldn't it?
Look, I don't know what they were actually. I honestly can't remember. The playback speakers we called them white elephants, and they were huge, great speakers. They had two 15-inch Wharfdales in them, and a car. I think they had a little tannoy tweeter in them, and they were used for studio playback. But we used to call them the white elephants because they only sounded any good down on the studio floor. They weren't suitable for monitoring.
Okay, those are the questions we got, so maybe we can move on to part 2.
Okay.
Thank you.
Right, now I've got another bit of video coming up in a minute, but so off to Australia. I left Abbey Road in 1970 and got married, and Jeannie and I travelled to Australia in 1971, and I walked into EMI Studios in Sydney and basically got a job, which I needed because I'd been travelling for quite a while and we'd completely run out of money. So So I joined what was then EMI Studios in Castlereagh Street in Sydney, which later became Studios 301. And, well, never looked back, really. I had a really good run there, which I'll talk about in a bit more detail in a moment. But let's go back and have a look at how things started out in Australia. While Abbey Road opened in 1931, EMI, or as it was then, the Columbia Graphophone Company, opened their studios and factory at Homebush in New South Wales, or the Western Sydney area, and they had a factory for producing discs, and they had a recording studio and a cutting room, and it was all completely self-contained. And the shot on the left is the old original Studio A at Homebush, and all the early EMI Australia artists would have recorded in there, including Slim Dusty made some records in there as well, before the facilities moved up to the current, the later site at 301 Castlereagh Street. Now, a couple of little bits of audio here. This is the speech given by the Governor of New South Wales at the time, Admiral Sir Dudley de Chair, and he's talking about this factory, and it's a wonderful piece of sort of colonial history.
President, ladies and gentlemen, I have very great pleasure in officially opening this new factory, the starting point of a new Australian venture. I should like to congratulate Mr. Parker, the Managing Director, a good Australian, and Mr. Power, the Factory Manager, on having together achieved quite remarkable results. This new factory, so conveniently located in the heart of Homebush, possesses 20 pressing machines of the most modern kind, which are capable of producing nearly 11 million records a year between them. But they have here the only recording plant in Australasia. This enterprise is backed entirely by British capital, the sum involved being £100,000. By the linking up of industrial concerns throughout the empire, we forge ever stronger links, binding us together all over the world. Again, permit me to offer my hearty congratulations on the splendid enterprise shown by the Columbia Graphophone Company in establishing this great industry, and I have much pleasure in officially declaring the factory open.
You sure that isn't Flanagan and Allen?
Well, I know it's like it's almost too funny to be true, but that I mean,
door knock. I love the door knock.
Well, you know what? When I first ended up, when I first came out to Australia from the UK, the manager at Abbey Road, he said, "Oh, you're going to the outstations, are you? The outstation, an outpost of empire, is what these EMI studios around the world were regarded as, and certainly it comes across in that speech there. It's such a sort of patronising kind of thing, isn't it? Anyway, now it's time to listen to a little bit of music, and this was the first recording ever made in that studio in 1926, featuring the Sydney Simpsons Wentworth Cafe Orchestra. Well, that was it, yeah. complete with all the surface noise and everything else. But yeah, historic recording, that one. So in 1954, the entire recording operation was moved from the Homebush factory site to the head offices in Castlereagh Street in Sydney, and the facilities there, 3 studios, mastering operation, technical workshop. But the facilities were very much set up with radio program production in mind rather than music, because that's where the market was for recording in those days. And when I came out in 1971 from the UK, this was really the equipment that I was confronted with, at least in one of the studios anyway, which was completely alien to the likes of myself and Richard Lush. We had to get our head around the idea of spinning in sound effects from 6 turntables and background music off a disc, and cueing an announcer in the studio extolling the virtues of Marlboro cigarettes or Coca-Cola or something else like that. And it was an alien process for both of us as music engineers. But fortunately, that part of the business was dying by the time we started working here in the 1970s. But this is really this is how the studio started out. And in fact, you can see in this shot here, there is actually a music session going on in there, but that would have been a mono recording through that old mixer there to probably a BTR2, I'd imagine. Very old stuff. And the recording space in the studio, that's what it looked like in 1954. And in fact, in 1971, it didn't actually look much different, apart from the fact there was a bit of carpet on the floor and some sound treatment on the walls. But that was the studio that we made all our recordings in during the 1970s, when that was the main studio at EMI Castlereagh Street. So very simple setup, 1 microphone. Look at that. Wouldn't have been too hard to mix that, would it? So now I've got a bit of video now, so I'm going to attempt to run some video. So wish me luck, folks. Now where are we? We just need to go to. Bit of history there, folks. Now, that was that generation of equipment. Those consoles that you just saw in that video were built by EMI at Homebush. They had quite a successful R&D department there, where quite a lot of studio equipment was built. But you know, we got used to the TG consoles at Abbey Road by that stage, and couldn't wait to see that technology introduced to the studios in Sydney. And in 1973-74, we got our first TG console from the UK, and this was the Mark II, rather like the one we saw at that factory site, the one being built in the previous section of the presentation. But it was a perfect combination of features, really. The 16-track Studer A80 and the TG console were a really good combination. And I felt we made some great records in those days using that technology. And of course, EMI used to make the tape as well, and that was pretty good stuff too. And unlike some of the Ampex and 3M tapes, which all fell to pieces during the 1970s and 80s after being stored for a few years, EMI tape lasted the duration, and you can still, if you can get hold of one of those tapes now and play it, they'll still work, amazingly enough. But that was Studio A control room in the early 1970s after the upgrade to the TG console, and made a lot of records in there, including this one with Mike McClellan. Yeah, we were pretty pleased with that recording. That was Mike McClellan's, one of Mike McClellan's albums. I think I made 3 albums with him actually over the years I worked with him at Castle Ray Street, and quite a lot of production involved there with a big string orchestra and a very professional rhythm section and some nice musicians to work with and some great equipment. So, you know, what more could you want? This is really the dream that I guess all recording engineers like to realize, having, you know, the great musicians to work with and the good equipment to do their jobs on. And I was lucky enough to be able to work in that environment for many, many years and make some reasonable records, I hope. Anyway, that's some time ago now in the 70s, but went on for quite a long time after that as well. Now, there's things changed in 1975 when I left EMI and I went freelance. I went out onto my own bat and formed a record label with an old colleague, John Sangster, a great Australian jazz legend and a wonderful fellow to work with. And John and I made a large number of albums under the Rainforest Records label. We never made any money out of it, but we had a lot of fun in the studios making records, that's for sure. But it was something that John was very passionate about, and he was very happy to put a lot of time and effort into making those recordings. And we had luckily we got distribution through EMI, which was good. So we had a way to get the records out there into the marketplace. But I think the fatal mistake we made with that record label was making too many records at once. And the first year of production, I think we put out 6 albums, but it was too much for the market, really. Whilst the music was great, it just wasn't mainstream enough for the market to be able to absorb it. The first release, one of the first releases we put out was the Lord of the Rings trilogy, which was a double album that John wrote, inspired by Tolkien's Lord of the Rings books. And his music was very atmospheric, let's say. So let's have a listen to, let's have a little bit of a listen to some of John's Lord of the Rings. Yeah, I won't play any more of that. It goes on a bit, but that was very much Mick Kenny, who was the writer in Crossfire, once said to me that John's music basically can be best described as cosmic Dixieland. So I wouldn't disagree with him on that one, but he was a wonderful guy to work with, and yeah, we made some good music together, I think, and had a lot of fun doing so. One of the other artists I did a fair amount of work with at the old EMI Studios was Julie Anthony, and we did a milestone recording there during the mid-70s involving a satellite hookup with Abbey Road, which was, I think, an industry first. Julie Anthony was over in London performing in a musical in the West End, and she was required to do a vocal for an Australian movie called Barney. And Tommy Tico was the musical director for that film, and we needed Julie's voice on the soundtrack for this film. So we had a satellite hookup with Abbey Road, and Julie did the vocal in Abbey Road while we listened in Sydney. And Tommy Tico was able to direct Julie Anthony through the vocals on her recording of that song in London over the satellite thing. It was pretty special, actually. Quite an interesting hookup, that one. That was it was sometime during the mid-70s anyway. Later on, 301 moved on from being the EMI Studios to Studios 301, and during the late 70s the studios were completely rebuilt, and the TG consoles were moved on, and we went Neve 8078, and we bought 3 of these consoles, and each of the 3 studios were equipped with Neve 8078 consoles, and the format that was chosen for the recording was dual 16-track. Now, interestingly enough, the world actually had already gone 24-track by the time this studio finally came online, but the manager of the studio at the time, Nigel Wake, who was the guy that managed to persuade EMI to spend several million pounds on redeveloping the studios, was an AES member and a very techie kind of a guy. And the AES had expressed a preference for dual 16-track as being the way forward for multi-track recording optimum quality. And I think they were quite right in terms of a 16-track machine sounding better than a 24. But the problem was that you were encumbered by synchronizers and multiple reels of tape and an incredibly cumbersome system of synchronizing these machines, which really we just didn't have time for. And the problem was the studio wasn't compatible with the outside world, which was rapidly going 24-track. So EMI had to take a big step backwards and back convert at least one of the 16-track machines in each control room to 24. And you'll notice at the back there of that control room, there's a little penthouse unit here with the extra 8 channels to make the machine a 24-track. So sitting alongside the 16-track. And it was a time when we also had a early automation system on the 8078 consoles, the NECAM system of moving faders. And that relied on these 8-inch floppy disks for storage and was notoriously unreliable. And you throw in the mix this awful TLS synchronization system on the multi-track machines. I have to say the whole system was almost unusable and would crash on multiple occasions. And really and truly, the whole concept of that dual 16-track and NECAM was just not executed very, very well indeed. And we had immense technical problems getting the studio to work really smoothly as a 24-track facility with automation that worked well. And in the end, we went for the George Massenburg flying faders to replace the NECAM system. And then we were up and running, and we had an automation system that really did work. It was great. So, yeah, that's interesting times indeed. But the studios at that stage were reconfigured completely from the old configuration that was opened up in 1954. On the 7th floor of the building, we had a very large mix-down suite with a small overdubbing booth, because so much of the work was mixing rather than live recording. And then up on the top floor of the building, we had Studios A and Studio B for live recording. So it was a busy place. There was lots going on all the time. The studios were working flat out, and we had some very, very fine artists coming through during those years. And I think 301, in that era was a immensely successful studio. I'll have a little bit more audio for you now. This is a recording of Sydney jazz fusion rock outfit, Crossfire. And I made a couple of albums with them. This one we recorded at Paradise Studios, as a matter of fact, in Sydney, and then we brought it back to 301 to mix it. And this is a tune called Youth in Asia. Yeah, Crossfire there with Youth in Asia, recorded at the Paradise Studios just in Woolloomooloo in Sydney, and then mixed in 301. This was still during the time I was freelance. I had a pretty good run, actually. I went freelance in 75 and kept cracking on until I ventured into studio management in 1986. And EMI offered me the position of general manager at 301, which I was a little hesitant to take on. I was very interested in the idea of it, but I didn't really want to give up recording because, you know, I developed a pretty solid roster of artists that I was working with, and I really enjoyed being in the studios recording, but I was still very interested in the idea of running studios because I always felt that they could be slightly better than they were at the time, and bringing some of the ideas that I had as an engineer into the running of the place I felt would benefit 301. So I took the plunge, and I managed to twist the arms of management to let me, if you like, fulfill a bit of a dual role, really. So I joined EMI in '86 as the studio manager, but I also carried on engineering. And during that time, we upgraded Studio B to its first SSL desk. I think this was the second one in Australia. The first one went into Rhinoceros Studios just up the road, which were giving us a real run for our money. Everybody wanted to work there because of the SSL. And we had the old Neve 8078s, which people regarded as dinosaurs, and they wanted to have something a little bit more contemporary. So we, in 1986, we managed to persuade EMI to part with a large sum of money, and we bought this SSL 4000E 4056 E console for Studio B and installed it, and it was an overnight success. Great desk. But it's a funny thing, though, because after we'd had that desk in there for about 3 or 4 years, people then started to go back to the Neves on purely sonic grounds. And everybody initially loved the transformerless input side of the SSL being so punchy and so bright and crisp and clean. But then again, there was something lacking in the warmth of the recording sound that came through the SSL. And so a lot of people went back to the Neves, you know, and so they stayed on in the building for quite some years before things all sort of went pear-shaped, but more of that a bit later on. But it was nice having the alternative of having an SSL in the building and also the 2 Neve desks as well. But the SSL was a fantastic mixing system. I mean, you really couldn't fault it. It was just a really amazing system with the total recall, and the level of automation on it was fantastic. Streets ahead of anything else in its time. Great desk. The other desk we put in during that period of time was this little sound workshop desk in Studio D. We built a little facility for doing jingles and sort of low-cost sessions, and with an MM1200 Ampex recorder, which you can just see in the corner there on the left. And you might recognize the gentleman in the middle of the picture. That's Dave Hudson, an early young Dave Hudson, next to me with a white shirt on. Glenn Finister on the right, and a couple of other notables there, Greg Cameron and Brett Crossley, and Tracy and Jackie. We had a great team in those days at 301. Good times. Later on, of course, in the late 80s, we started to get interested in digital multitracks, and there was a format war going on in the industry, which I'm sure a lot of engineers can well remember. The Sony versus Mitsubishi war, the dash format versus the PD format, dash being the half-inch digital multitrack format. Started out as a 24-track system and then ultimately went to 48. And Studer and Sony machines supported that format, whereas Mitsubishi went their own way with the PD format, and as did Otari, I believe, and running 32 tracks on 1 inch. And after a lot of arguing and procrastination, EMI decided to go with the X880 Mitsubishi machines, and we bought, I think we bought 3 of them, and we had them sitting alongside. So each control room had a 32-track Mitsubishi and a 24-track, either an A800 or an A80. So we could still support the 24-track analog format, or 48 for that matter. The machine next to the Mitsubishi there is an A820, Studer A820 analog machine. This photo was taken actually over at Festival Studios, and I just wanted a picture of an X880 to show you. But it was great with the Neve 8078, the X880, because the 8078 console had 32 buses and a 32-channel monitor system. So it was almost tailor-made for the 8078. And I personally loved that combination. It was extremely easy and quick and fast to use. And the X880 had pretty good A to D converters on it compared to the early Sony machines, which their A to Ds left something to be desired, in my opinion. The later machines were much better, and a lot of people, converted their machines to Apogee converters to get the sound even better. And in fact, some of the people did the X880s as well in that regard. But we made some very good records on those X880s, and a little bit of audio now. This was one of the last recordings I made before I sort of more or less hung my hat up as a recording engineer and went into sort of studio management pretty much full time back in London at Abbey Road. But this was a recording with Don Burrows and the Julian Lee Orchestra we made in Studio A using the Mitsubishi, and it's a nice record. We've got another break coming up, but I just wanted to touch on the sort of, not so much the technical aspects of the business now, but more really the corporate side, and where things sort of started to go a little bit pear-shaped for us was when EMI sold the building to Meriton, Harry Triggerboff, and the record company moved out of the building completely over to the North Shore in Cremorne and left the studios on the 7th and 8th floors with a lease agreement with Meriton. And basically, once EMI had gone and Meriton started to tear the building apart, our lives became an absolute misery. The noise, it was like being in a building site and trying to run a recording studio, and we had a very, very difficult couple of years there, and it got very difficult at times. But we battled on, and it got to about 1989, I guess, was when all this started to happen, and that was for me really. That was really kind of the beginning of the end of my time with 301, actually, certainly in its present form, because a couple of years later I went back to the UK, but I'll talk about that in a minute. I think we should have a break now for some questions and answers.
That's very good. You did ask if we were running out of time. We're well into the run-out groove, but nobody's complaining, so we'll keep going.
Yep, okay.
Now, I've got some questions. There was a carryover question that came in from Graham Haynes, and I missed it. He said the DK audio meter seems to be out of place in this console. Did you recall a DK meter on one of those consoles?
That might have been a modification that was done after the console left Abbey Road, I suppose. That was one of the Abbey Road desks, was it?
I think it was.
Yes, yeah, that was a mod that was done off-site, nothing to do with us.
It was the Mark IV. I think it was the Mark IV.
Yeah. I wonder what that device was, actually. So thank you, Graham. That's enlightened us.
It's the other Graham.
The other Graham,
right,
yeah.
Yes. Tom Fine said recorded to a Scully 4-track, 280B, mixed to a BTR, cut from a BTR with a preview loop, ? He saw the Autofon cutter head, which he said was unusual.
Yes, well, that was the format they had, but there was a preview head on the BTR for that cutting room. Yes, yeah, there was.
And David down there, he said that there was a Scully 280, and it was like the Little Mountain Sound Vancouver machines and an Autofine cutting head.
Yeah,
the occasional spare in the basement, he said.
Yes, that's right. I didn't have a lot to do with the cutting side of the business at EMI in the early days, so I wouldn't be much of an authority to talk about that side of it. But the Scully 4-track machine, I used quite a lot, and basically couldn't wait until we went to 8-track and then 16, because it was an absolutely horrible machine, always riddled with faults, and I just didn't like it. I never really got on with that Scully 4-track. Not that I used it for very long, probably a year, 18 months at the most, and then we got the 3M 8-track, and then of course the Studer A80 16-track. So I was put out of my misery.
Ali wanted to know, how many records did you release under Rainforest Records?
About 8 albums.
That was over a 2-year period?
Yes.
Okay, now I'm looking for questions. There's a lot of comments here which you probably should read. Right, Chris Ludwig said, Martin, harking back to John Sangster, did you have any association with his 1973 album, The Hobbit Suite?
Yes, I recorded it.
That answers that.
Yeah.
Tom Fine asked, did EMI ship any of their proprietary digital recorders to Australia, or did you ever use one in the UK? This was the machine that used the industrial video recorder for storage.
I don't really know anything about that, actually.
No problem, we move on.
EMI probably sold, they may have, there was a BTR4, which I think appeared in, I think they had one at Channel 10 for a while in Sydney. That was a 1/4-inch machine. But
on the PCM side, Martin, Sony brought in the PCM 1600, early days PCM, and BVU 200, and we recorded the Kerry Vidal and Compared to What direct to digital.
That's right. Yeah, that was the first all-to-digital album, wasn't it?
September 79. It was Mike Pradanik, producer, Jerry Nixon, engineer, and we all, the technical guys in the background, got our hands around PCM. Sony were there supporting it, and that was the first PCM machine. But Tom, it was only Sony, and from that day it was 1600, then 1610, then 1630, and DDU 1510, and DA 1100, DA 3000, all that Sony PCM family, 2-channel. And I went on the PCM 3324 course in Atsugi when I was at EMI, thinking we might go Dash, but then EMI UK decided globally we'll go PD X880, X850, 880, 1H 32-channel. So we didn't ever see any proprietary digital recorder of EMI in Australia. And Martin, I think you said you didn't use any in the UK?
No,
okay.
we didn't. No.
So that answers Tom's question. Great question.
Okay, that's good. If anybody has a question and they want to clarify, please unmute and come in on the question. That'd be good. Okay, that brings us up to now and the next years. Thank you.
Okay, well, the next part of the talk really isn't so much technical. It's more about the sort of the business side of the industry and what really happened to EMI ultimately. But really, I think the rot set in as soon as EMI sold that building to Harry Triggerboff and Meriton, and never really recovered from that. But the next thing that happened to me was in 1992, actually. I'd been studio manager at 301 for 9 years, and we were muddling along, I guess, as best we could with the the lack of investment and everything else that was going with it. And then I got a call from my old friend Ken Townsend, who was the manager at Abbey Road, to tell me he was retiring, but that EMI had just purchased Richard Branson's Virgin Music Group for £582 million, incredible amount of money. And along with that purchase came all the Branson Townhouse, Olympic, Manor, Townhouse 3, Manor Mobiles recording facilities. So EMI suddenly found themselves as being the major worldwide player in recording studios, because all these studios became part of the EMI group. And EMI wanted someone to go over and develop a business plan to get these studios all working together and making lots of money for EMI. And they thought that I might be the right man for the job. But it was quite a daunting prospect, really, because we were in a declining market at the time for recording studios, no doubt about it, with the onset of home recording and cheap digital equipment beginning to hit the scene, and the impact of that had on the major studios. But I was happy to accept the position. It was a great opportunity, and as things were kind of not looking so great in Australia, I thought I'd grab the opportunity. So I went over to London in 1993 and back to Abbey Road for 5 years, and worked there on a number of very, very interesting projects, including the Beatles anthology, which was one of the first jobs that I got involved in when I got there. I had a meeting with George Martin fairly early on in my time back at Abbey Road, and he was explaining to me that the three remaining Beatles had agreed to get together and produce a series of recordings from the old master tapes of stuff that they had never been released before, outtakes and songs that never got used, and a lot of old video stuff as well. And Paul McCartney was very keen to do it in his studio down in Rye, which was equipped with a Neve and 24-track machines and everything else, and he was very keen to get his hands on all the old Beatle tapes and go and work on them down in his house. But George Martin thought it would be a better idea to do it at Abbey Road. But so there was a meeting. Paul, George and Ringo came into Abbey Road and got together. The first time they'd been in the building together since about 1970, and shortly after I'd taken over as manager. So, I mean, it was absolutely amazing to be there that day with these three guys being reunited in the studio. And the outcome of the discussions was that they would only do it at Abbey Road if we could put together the original equipment, get a TG console, and we could go back and use the old 4-track machines and work on the tapes as Jeff Emerick did in the early days. And of course, the other thing to do was for Jeff Emerick to come and do the mixing. So, and then George Martin turned around to me and he said, "You think you can put all that together?" I had a big swallow because the TG consoles had long gone. They'd all been sold. We only had a portable one that used to go out on OBs, and that actually belonged to Jeff Jarrett, one of the engineers who used to work there. So anyway, to cut a long story short, we pulled it all together, and the anthology project took off, and we got all the old master tapes out of the vault, and Jeff Emerick and George Martin and Paul and George and Ringo, one by one, went through it all and produced the Beatles anthology. So a triumph for Abbey Road, that was, indeed. So, and then lots of other things went on in the UK, but I mean, that's probably another presentation in itself, all the Virgin Studios, so I don't really want to go into that now. But just getting back to 301, this is the timeline really of how things sort of developed from there. In 95, EMI sold the whole studio business to its studio manager, Jim Tague, who put together a group of investors. That lasted about 2 years, or 3 years actually. Tom Misner started construction of his own facilities in Mitchell Road, Alexandria. He bought the old Commonwealth Bank and started building a large-scale recording facility there, just about the time I got back to Sydney, as a matter of fact. And Tom had been to see me in London, and we talked vaguely about this while he was there. So I hooked up with him when I came back from London. I'd left EMI. I'd had enough of corporate life and looking at spreadsheets and trying to work out what to do with all these studios. And while things were going quite well over there, I thought, well, I'm going to quit while I'm ahead and go back and resume life in Australia, which is where the family wanted to be. And certainly, I was very happy to come back. And so I got involved with Tom in constructing his new facilities in Sydney. But in the meantime, Jim was quite keen to sell the 301 business because he'd come to the end of his tether with his finances and so on and so forth. And so I put it to Tom that he should buy 301 and amalgamate it into Mirage, and then he'd have a ready-made team, experienced team of studio people. He'd have a great brand, 301, and he'd have all that equipment that was there. And all we needed was a decent building to go in. So I managed to talk him into it, and Tom bought 301. And in '99, new 301 recording facilities opened up at Alexandria in Sydney, and a fine facility it was too. A large orchestral room with 2 control rooms that could be used independently or at the same time. It's a great concept. So one could be used for mixing while the other was recording, and vice versa. So a very flexible setup, really, and a nice big room where you could get an orchestra. Other milestone was in 2016. 301 celebrates 90 years of recording in Australia since the old days in Homebush, and relocated to another facility yet again in Alexandria in Sydney. And in February 2018, Tom and the new 301 setup opened after $12 million of investment in Mitchell Road, Alexandria. And this is the Studio A control room as it is today. Wonderful setup. With the Neve 88R that came out of the other studio in Alexandria, and still an absolutely fantastic console. And the PNC monitoring and state-of-the-art everything really in that studio. It's a wonderful setup. I don't think it'll ever make any money, but I think Tom knew that. So, quick timeline of EMI, just to see what happened here. 1917, the Columbia Graphophone was formed in the US, and then the British Gramophone Company bought it out when it went bust, and the Gramophone Company was formed, joined forces with Columbia Graphophone Company to become EMI in 1931, about the time Abbey Road opened, and they moved all those facilities to the other studios, to Hayes. 79, Thorn Industries merges with EMI to become Thorn EMI. And then in 92, as we've just been talking about, Thorn EMI buys Richard Branson's outfit for £582 million. He was interested in opening an airline, getting Virgin Atlantic up and running, and I think it might have paid for a few jumbo jets, that money. And then in 96, EMI demerges from Thorn to become EMI again. And 2007, things are looking dicey, and a private equity group purchased EMI for £4.7 billion, the worldwide organisation. And then that went down the gurgler, and the finances for that purchase by Terra Firma were put forward by Citigroup. And so Citigroup suddenly found themselves the owners of a record label, which they didn't really want. And then in 2011, the whole business was sold to Universal Music, and EMI breaks up as a company in 2012. So Abbey Road now is part of Universal Music, and EMI is swallowed up into Universal Music just as a collection of record labels, Parlophone being one of them. So it lives on under the umbrella of Universal Music. So what now? I've got a new career, guess what? I'm a little volunteer radio presenter at our local radio station down here in Jervis Bay, and this is what you hear when you tune in.
Welcome to Strolling Down Memory Lane. This is Martin on 92.7 Bay and Basin FM, inviting you to join me as we set off on another easy listening musical journey, playing my selection of music from the world's favourite artists.
Oh dear, quite sad really, but that's what it's come to. So apart from, talking to people like your good selves and doing a lot of restoration of old recordings at home and dabbling around in the radio station, I'm having a great life. I really am. I'm really enjoying myself.
There's some questions, but I think what I might do in a minute or so is open it up to general discussion. But somebody there, Ross Cockle, said that I think we're looking at a Martin Benge Part 2 for your studio design life.
Well, look,
I'd certainly support that.
Yeah, well, that's another whole presentation in itself, really. It's kind of hard to know where to draw the line, really, because I could do a whole one on the Virgin and the EMI thing in London. That's all the townhouse and the other studios there. But I think the essence of today's presentation really was the milestones in the industry, and I'll just zip through these here. The digital milestones, that is, of where things went. I remember very clearly when I heard my first CD in 1982, when the record execs from CBS came into 301, and we had to listen to Toto's Africa on the speakers in Studio M and playing off a CD, and it blew us all away. It was unbelievable just hearing that. Just the lack of the lack of background noise, we're so used to hearing off vinyl. Dave was talking about the 1610 system, which was in use at 301 in the early 1980s for mastering CDs and also recording, as he mentioned with that thing. And then in 81, these two PD and Dash format were released. Pro Tools launched in 91, and we went through some serious pain trying to integrate Pro Tools into 301 as a recording system. Oh boy. And of course still supporting reel-to-reel digital on the Dash format Studer machines we had then, the 24-track Studers digital machines. Good machine, actually. But so much hardware, having to support analog 24-track as well. And then the biggest thing, really, the impact on the industry, in my opinion anyway, was when Steve Jobs developed the concept of the iPod and the iTunes software, and how it could be used to market and develop and distribute music. I just wish it had been one of the music companies that had done it, really, but it took a computer guy to do it, But really, that spelt the end, really, of the record business, ultimately, I think, as we knew it, with the idea of buying hard product. And then on the professional level, of course, we now have high-res digital recording on something as simple as a mobile phone. Incredible where it's gone, isn't it? The amount of hardware that we'd need to produce all that in the past And then just looking down the track a little bit, I think the high-end studios are still the place to work if you want the best results. New technology coming along and artificial intelligence, I think it'll drive new ways of working with audio in the future. And then there's no doubt about it, the online collaboration side of it does produce more opportunities for music production and possible business for studios as well. And then alongside that, there's a continuing interest in analog and products such as vinyl, which is enjoying such a massive resurgence. And the last word, onwards and upwards with the journey. Thank you all very much. Any
very
questions?
Good, Martin, very good. Yes, if you can all open up your microphone channels now. Thank you, Martin. Amazing. The general questions, there was a comment, Tom Fine, are you still there? Oh, good. Thanks, Tom. Sorry to get you up so early. Where are you? You're here somewhere.
5:30 a.m. New York time.
Oh, there you are. You're next to me. Thanks, Tom. Yes, did you want to clarify on your comments? Probably worthwhile doing that. So did you want to make...
about?
You're talking about the experiences you'd had as well. Yeah. I've just had a flood of questions and I've lost you.
No, I just was saying with the breakup of EMI music, the majority of it did go to Universal, but the classical business that Martin had worked at made some albums. That's owned by Warner's now, Warner Music.
Yeah, that's right. They did get a piece of it. Yeah, you're quite right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I didn't cover that.
And in fact, the tapes were stored at Abbey Road for a long time, and Abbey Road worked under contract, still doing remastering. I know because I work with Universal, and I actually work with Abbey Road quite a bit nowadays. So
yeah, oh, that's great. Well, EMI have an archive facility at Hayes, actually, on the factory site, which is factory's long gone, but they put a purpose-built facility up many years ago, probably 20 years ago, to house all the master tapes and all the archive material. And it's a fascinating place to go because it's the history of the recording business all under one roof, and all the master tapes that were produced by the company that still exists are all housed there.
Is that a museum now, or did Warner's end up with that?
Well, I guess I guess Warner's own it now, but I would think they probably would own it now. Yeah, not sure.
The Universal Vault is in Watford.
Mm-hmm.
It's owned by Iron Mountain because Universal outsourced all their vault stuff to Iron Mountain.
Yeah. Okay.
Anyway, thank you. Great presentation.
Okay.
Thank you. I hope you found it interesting.
General questions.
I found it absolutely fascinating, and I would love to have you come back and talk more about the bits that you didn't include in tonight's presentation.
Yes, I second that, Rod. Thank you.
Quite a few supporters by the sound of it. I think it's all just general support. So we don't have any questions.
Yes, I have one going back, still talking about those tower speakers in the studio, because I don't know why I was surprised that the Beatles used those speakers for playback to do their vocals to. And that when you listen to the early recordings, I start to imagine that I can hear spill from the band track, but there can't have been that much. Were you using those speakers for playback to do vocals?
Yeah, well, very often a lot of people didn't like using cans, and a lot of artists were much more comfortable to do vocals with a speaker fallback, So, and of course, it was never loud enough, so you were right on the edge of ruining your backing, by folding back stuff to that wretched speaker. But EMI, actually, I'd forgotten, because things come back to you. When I went to EMI originally in 1964, they were making their own speakers for the studios, And they made a particular speaker which they put a lot of effort into, and it was a 10x8 elliptical speaker, and it sat in a kind of column cabinet with a leak amplifier in the bottom of it. So it was an amped speaker operated from line level, and it was a damn fine speaker. I actually had a pair. I managed to get a pair myself when they changed over to the Altex, but they were killed off by the bass guitar. The cones were very, very soft suspension, and once the bass guitar came along, those speakers just couldn't handle the bottom end, and they just used to blow out. So they had to go, and then that's when the Altex came in.
So when did the studio have headphones for use during that time? Was it the mid-60s or something, was it?
Oh, early 60s. I mean, headphones were there right from the time I started anyway, from the early 60s, but it's just that a lot of acts didn't like to use them. They felt uncomfortable with them. And the fallback controlling the fallback from that old red mixer was absolutely hopeless. You had no individual channel feed for a headphone mix of any description. The best you could do really was feed them the part of the monitor mix.
Yeah, so you had as much trouble. I'll pass it over to someone else in a minute. But you had as much trouble with the changeover to solid state from Valve as Jeff Emmerich sort of explained in his book.
Yes, yeah, it was terrible. I mean, we'd worked with those red consoles for so many years and just got so used to them, and they were very, very forgiving in many respects. But apart from that, they just sounded great. I mean, that's the bottom line. And then the TG came along, and it was just so different that you were on a learning curve to get back to where you were years before.
You had no say in it whatsoever. You couldn't say, well, can you keep one studio as all Valve and one studio as... You had no say in it whatsoever.
Not really, no. We had in Abbey Road, there was a research lab on the top floor with its own chief engineer, and Mike Batchelor, the guy that designed the TG consoles, was based up there as well. And they dictated what equipment we used. That all the decisions were made by the engineers, and we just had to cop whatever was given to us. Really, they fought. They really didn't want to let us have that 3M8 track because of its shortcomings as far as they were concerned. But the Beatles were just putting so much pressure, and Floyd as well, putting so much pressure on us for more tracks, that we just, they just had to accept the fact that they were going to be, washed over by the tide if they didn't do something about it. So we got the 3M.
I'm sorry to make you relive that, but that was good.
No, it's
Thanks, Ross.
When you ask me a question, then I remember it, but
just keep asking questions, Ross.
Following on that, Martin, in the transition from 16 to 24, also saw the importance of noise reduction. Do you have any comments on the effect of noise reduction on the sonics of the recorder?
Rod Brown here. I'd like to ask a question about your miking layout for classical recordings, please, Martin.
Yeah, sure.
One of those photos, I think it was the Menuhin one, I can see things hanging up there. It looked as if your front row of mics are actually over the top of the violins and not out the front of the orchestra.
I think it's more likely they would have been close to the front of the orchestra. It might have been an optical illusion, but that setup there were... I don't actually think that was my setup, that particular one that we had there. There were 3 M50s out the front of the orchestra there, 3 omnidirectional M50s, and they were spaced probably 9, 10, 12 feet apart, I suppose, something like that. And probably more or less in a line across the front of the orchestra rather than out over the top. But the technique I use with the cardioid mics, I'd like to have the centre mic over the top of the conductor's head, really, and then and the other two mics kind of looking out towards the violins on the left, and then your cellos and basses on the right. Although some conductors actually like to split the first and the second violins and have the first on one side and the seconds on the other. And for recording, that actually was quite nice, because often in a lot of recording sessions with the cellos and the basses and the violas all on one side, you've got quite a dark sound on the right hand side, and you've got the bright violins on the left, and sometimes the right side of the spectrum gets a bit muddy. But splitting the first and second violins left and right actually gives you quite a pleasing stereo image.
And you sometimes see pit orchestras laid out like that too.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And secondly, regarding miking soloists, did you, before you started using more of the local microphones up the back of the orchestra, did you have a separate mic on the soloist typically, or is that just done by balance?
No, always a solo mic. Yeah. Invariably. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rod.
Martin,
Chris.
Hi, Chris.
Was the quad company involved at all with supplying any speakers or amplifiers to the studio?
Not that I know of, but that's not to say it didn't happen. But not on my watch anyway, while I was there.
Rick Curtin.
Hello, Rick.
Hey, mate. Thank you for reminding what nightmare the dual lock 16 tracks were. They were that from coming off nice valve consoles to the Neve and then trying to work with dual lock 16 tracks.
Yeah.
I think I nearly went insane.
Yeah. Well, there was only one more nightmare, even worse than that, and that was Q lock.
Oh yes.
And then all of that locked to video with the orchestral session in Studio A, trying to chase video with two tape locked 16 tracks.
But I think you guys in Melbourne, Ross, had the right idea. The Editron was a very, very good synchronizer.
Amen.
And I think it actually, beat the pants off Q lock and TLS and all that other crap we had to put up with.
Graham Circle.
Graham Circle for that. I mean, they kept trying lots of things, and Graham was constantly, Roger would throw an idea at Graham and Graham would come back and that worked well for a long time after us trying a few different machines, just because of the amount of film soundtracks Roger got in and then we were all doing. We just had to have it working, and we went through a similar nightmare with the machines taking ages to sync up and lock, and then video.
Yeah.
But, to throw in the unfortunate Optronics multi-tracks.
Yes.
That could be a story I could tell. I won't know.
Well, you know what? There was another nightmare came back to us in the 1990s when we started using the early versions of Pro Tools as a recorder with an orchestra in the studio. Yeah. Oh boy. That was a nightmare.
Yeah, the early Pro Tools had so many. I remember seeing a 2-track version and going, and it just sounded horrible because of the converters, but do what it was supposed to do. But now it's, it's beyond taken over, hasn't it? And I just love it for the editing, anything, and for the spontaneous nature of it. You can keep all your recordings. I noticed your digital recording still had your analog ears, like an analog recording, which is you and your mic selection. But
I've got a quick question. Just a quick question.
Hold it, David.
Legend has it that the STC 4021 ball and biscuit mics were still used in EMI as room ambience and drum overheads right into the 1970s. This is a 1930s mic. I just wonder if that's true or not.
Yeah, look, I think as far as my recollection goes, there were quite a few ball and biscuit mics at Abbey Road. and they used to hang in the control room, and they'd be connected up to a phon meter to measure the level of sound in the control room from the monitor speakers. That's the only use that I can ever recall that they were used for. We never used them on music. The 4038 was the STC 4038 was a very popular mic, great ribbon mic for brass. But the ball and biscuit, I never got my hands on one in the studio.
Well, that's great to hear. It clarifies that point. Thank you. And thanks for your wonderful presentation. It's been amazing.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks, David. David,
quick one.
Been very patient.
Quick one. This is about analog tape, and I know I follow the Ampex Digest, and Tom Fine has done some wonderful work comparing the sound of various brands of tape, and the general characteristics. And I'm just wondering, back in your career with EMI tape 811, 206, and subsequent generations of analog tape, do you have any feeling about a particularly favorite sound quote unquote of analog tape, or it's swamped by other things like consoles and rooms and mics and speakers and whatever? Do you have any thoughts about the medium itself?
Well, yeah, I think the 456 I think was an excellent tape. Some of the earlier Ampex tapes were, in my opinion, not as great. But really and truly, I just saw EMI stop making tape because the EMI tape was great. It was it was consistent. It was
we used it,
long lasting, and but in the end, with a 24 track machine, compared to a 16, there was such a change, when we went from 16 to 24 in terms of what you were getting back off tape. You had to kind of rethink things again, really. You just couldn't push the machine as hard as you could with you had a 16 track format, or when it went to 24, it was sort of disappointing in a way. You had the extra tracks, but you didn't have the punch. So you had to work around that and come up with something that delivered the goods. But I don't have any really huge sort of statements to make on tapes. No.
Right. Thank you.
You do the best you can with what's available. Yeah.
Following on that, Martin, in the transition from 16 to 24, also saw the importance of noise reduction. Do you have any comments on the effect of noise reduction on the sonics of the recorder?
How long have you got? Oh, look.
Long story.
Yes, look, it's the lesser of two evils, really. If you're working on music with a very wide dynamic range, particularly for, say, 24 track, you orchestral or something, and you've got a lot of tracks, you need noise reduction for 24 track, in my opinion. It's just too noisy if you don't have it. And so I think we used to use the DBX system on the 16 track machines, and I found it to be quite successful for certain material. But if you were doing rock and roll, then you don't want noise reduction. Better not to use it, because it does take it takes the punch out of it, takes the immediacy out of the sound. But if you're doing music for film particularly, and noise floor is such an issue, sometimes noise reduction is something that you've really got to seriously consider using to get a nice quiet end product.
Martin, going back to 3MI tape, I remember in England, when we first went to 24 track, we used to over bias the drum tracks quite a lot, just so we get that punch back. And the 3M, the EMI tape would just take it. It would just, you could belt the hell out of it. It would come back sounding great.
That's right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. We were onto that. Yes, that's right. I didn't really make a lot of rock and roll records, really. I did most of the work that I've done in the studio has been with orchestras or jazz groups, but not many it wasn't my thing really, recording rock and roll. And I found that in the late 70s, we would get a band in from one of the major record labels, and they'd have a huge budget, and the amount of time that was wasted, there'd be 2 days getting a drum sound, and you'd just lose all the energy, and you'd come back the next day and then somebody in the band doesn't like it and you start again, and life's too short, and I just really enjoyed working with players who could come in and they'd be there for the session and play their asses off really well. We capture it as best we could and walk out of the door at the end of the day having achieved something. And the frustrations that sometimes arose on some of those rock sessions, it didn't appeal to me too much, really. The egos, but I'm digressing here from the matter of over-biasing tape.
Okay. We've got enough people here to have a lot of questions. We haven't got a lot of questions, so I guess we're getting towards the end. Oh, no, there's a question. Yes.
Yes, I have a question.
Tali.
Hi, Tali.
Hello. Excellent presentation, Martin. Thank you. I'm interested to know a little bit more about Rainforest Records. Was that purely a jazz label that you started, and where can we hear these recordings?
Gee, that's a good question. Well, when I went to the UK, sadly, John passed away, and all his master tapes went up to his partner in Queensland, and then she passed away, and I've no idea where all those recordings are now. I've got vinyl copies of most of it, but where the master tapes are, I don't know. There was one in particular I was trying to track down, one of John's recordings called Australia and All That Jazz Volume 2, and which we did feature. It features Don Burrows very heavily, that one, multi-track Don Burrows flutes. Was a recording of which I was never 100% happy with anything I ever did, but I was happier with that than I was with a lot of other stuff I worked on. And but I just don't know where the master is. No idea who's got it. And I've just got, all I've got's the vinyl. But I'd love to know where all those master tapes are, because I think they'd stand the test of time and would be good to get it to them again. Maybe I should get on the case and make a bit of effort to try and find them.
Absolutely.
But that was all jazz, and most of it John Sangster's work, but we didn't record. But within John Sangster's sphere of musicians, there'd be other artists like Bob Bernard and Len Bernard, and the wonderful vibraphone player from Melbourne, Alan. What's his name? Yeah, it's gone. But there were some great musicians within John's group of players that would come in and perform his music, and then occasionally, they do a tune of their own. And we did quite a bit of work with people like Dave Dalwitz, but I think he went out on Swaggy Records. Neville Sherburn, and of course Bill Armstrong's re-released quite a lot of that stuff on the Bill Arm label. So, yeah.
That would have been Alan Lee, I think.
Alan Lee, that's it. Yep, Alan Lee, yeah. John and Alan did an album called Double Vibes, and two vibraphone players together. Fabulous. Great stuff. Fun to record.
Good. Questions? Okay.
Favorite mics? Last question.
Favorite mics? David.
U47.
Okay.
All right. We're probably into daylight hours in the East Coast now. I think we would be. I really enjoyed tonight very much, and I'm sure we all did. We're closing up now, and as AES Melbourne, and representing the wider Zoom audience, I want to thank you, Martin, for taking the time to prepare and present and put up all the foibles that we had, the technology, and come through with a shining Academy Award. So I really want to thank you for that. I also give some thanks to the Melbourne AES Committee and our Secretary, Peter Smurden in particular, for his tireless effort in getting this all to happen. So thank you very, very much, Martin. And
My pleasure.
I do get up to where you are to see my brother-in-law. So be aware that I'll be calling in sometime if I can find you.
Yeah, give me look me up. Yeah,
Right,
shouldn't be too hard.